3:18 a.m., the emergency room at a major Dallas hospital. The air is thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Dr. Daniel Carter has been on his feet for 14 straight hours, treating everything from gunshot wounds to cardiac arrests. He is spent. As he leans against a cold tile wall, a local officer marches in, shoving a handcuffed man forward. The officer looks at Daniel's bloodshot eyes and sneers. "Rough night, Doc. You look half asleep. Try not to kill my prisoner." Daniel says nothing. He just reaches for his stethoscope. 5 minutes later, the front doors burst open. Federal agents have arrived. The night shift in a level 1 trauma center is a grueling war of attrition that most people can barely imagine. By the time 3 o'clock in the morning rolls around, the manic adrenaline that fuels the early evening rush has long since evaporated into the sterile air, replaced by a bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that makes every physical movement feel like walking through waist-high water. Dr. Daniel Carter is a battle-hardened veteran of this unforgiving environment, a man who has witnessed more human tragedies and miraculous survivals in a single decade than most people see in an entire lifetime. He remembered the smell of gasoline from the earlier pileup, the way the mangled metal had to be cut away from a victim's legs, a reminder that life is fragile and physics is indifferent. His back spasmed with every breath, but he pushed the pain into a small, locked room in the back of his mind. He had to be a vessel for the science, nothing more. But tonight has been particularly brutal, even by the high-intensity standards of Dallas. A 6-car pileup on the I-35 followed by a multi-victim shooting in the downtown district had drained the hospital's resources and pushed Daniel's physical and mental stamina to its absolute breaking point. His white coat is crumpled, his scrubs are stained with the invisible residue of a dozen surgical battles, and his hands stay steady now only by the sheer force of practiced iron will. He had just finished the delicate task of suturing a complex facial laceration on a teenage girl when Officer Miller marched into the bay. Miller is the kind of patrol officer who believes a badge and a gun give him the inherent right to be the loudest, most dominant voice in any room he occupies. He is clearly tired too, coming off a long shift of his own, but he chooses to handle his fatigue with outward aggression and biting sarcasm, rather than the quiet, professional discipline of the medical staff. He shoves the patient, a man named Marcus who looks profoundly disoriented, shivering uncontrollably, and dangerously pale, into Trauma Bay 4. Marcus's wrists are raw, red, and swollen from the tight metal cuffs, and he seems to be struggling to keep his heavy head upright as the fluorescent lights buzz overhead. With a dismissive, arrogant flick of his wrist, Miller tosses a thin manila folder onto the stainless steel counter, the sound echoing sharply. He barks at Daniel that he found this one wandering aimlessly near a warehouse break-in on the industrial east side of the city. He claims the suspect is complaining of a vague headache, which Miller interprets as a blatant, pathetic attempt to delay his inevitable processing at the precinct. "Just give him a quick look so I can get back to the station and finish my damn paperwork before the sun comes up," Miller says, his voice booming far too loudly in the quiet, sterile hallway. Daniel approaches the bed with a heavy, rhythmic step. He doesn't look at Miller, and he certainly doesn't acknowledge the petty, unnecessary insult about being half asleep. In the high-stakes world of the ER, ego is a luxury that often costs lives, and Daniel doesn't have a single drop of energy to waste on it. He begins his primary assessment with the mechanical precision of a machine: airway, breathing, circulation. Within seconds, his clinical intuition begins to scream. He immediately notices that Marcus's skin is clammy, cool to the touch, and covered in a fine sheen of sweat that doesn't match the ambient temperature. His heart rate is high, far too high to be explained away by simple arrest nerves or the stress of being handcuffed. Despite the physical evidence mounting right in front of him, Miller continues to sigh audibly and check his heavy watch with exaggerated, theatrical impatience. He tells Daniel that he doesn't need the full luxury diagnostic suite for a petty thief and demands that the doctor just sign the medical clearance form so they can get on with the booking. The nurses in the room, Sarah and James, glance at each other with tight, frustrated lips. They've worked alongside Daniel for years, and have seen him save countless lives while the rest of the world was sleeping in safety. They know the look that is currently settling into his eyes. It's not fatigue pulling his strings right now. It's intense, hyper-focused clinical analysis. They see the glaring injustice of the situation. A man who has spent 14 hours holding death at bay for total strangers is being talked down to by someone who just wants to go home and watch television. But Daniel remains a quiet professional. He understands that his job isn't to win a shouting match with the police. It's to be the final, unwavering line of defense for the human being lying helpless and broken on the table. Ignoring Miller's escalating complaints and his restless pacing, Daniel calmly orders a stat blood panel, a comprehensive toxicology screen, and a head CT. Miller scoffs at the request, his voice dripping with condescension as he asks if they are really going to waste hard-earned taxpayer money on an MRI for a common junkie. He tells Daniel to get it together, suggesting with a smirk that the doctor is clearly too tired to think straight or make a rational medical decision. The tension in the bay is thick enough to feel, a heavy fog of conflict, but Daniel's focus never once wavers from the shivering man in handcuffs. He is looking for the truth, while the officer is only looking at the clock. If you think medical workers deserve respect during emergencies, type unfair. Daniel remains stone silent as he begins to palpate the patient's abdomen, his fingers searching for a source of the internal distress he senses through his gloves. He notices a detail that Officer Miller completely missed in his rush to judge and his desire for a quick exit. Marcus isn't just disoriented. His pupils are reacting sluggishly to light, pinned like needle points, and there's a strange, sweet chemical odor clinging to his breath. It doesn't smell like alcohol, and it definitely isn't the familiar, acrid scent of common street narcotics. It's something sharper, something industrial, something that reminds Daniel of a laboratory he once visited years ago. Miller continues to pace the small room, the rhythmic metallic clack of his heavy-duty boots acting as a constant, grating irritant to the focused medical team. He leans against the doorframe, crossing his arms and projecting an aura of bored, annoyed authority that feels entirely misplaced. "He's faking those tremors, Doc," Miller says with a dismissive wave of his hand, his eyes scanning the room for a distraction. They all do it once the cuffs go on and the reality of a cell sets in. We call it the jailhouse flu. Don't fall for the act. He's just looking for a soft hospital bed instead of a cold bench. Daniel doesn't look up. He doesn't even flinch. Instead, he leans in closer to Marcus, placing a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. Daniel felt the vibration of the patient's vocal cords, a desperate, rattling struggle that hinted at the closing of an airway. It wasn't just medicine now. It was a race against a clock made of poison. He asked the man in a low, gentle, and grounding voice if he can remember exactly where he was tonight before the police found him. Marcus tries to speak, his chest heaving, but his voice is nothing more than a dry, terrifying rasp. He stammers out that he was working at a lab, his eyes darting around the room in a panic, and he whispers that it wasn't supposed to leak. Miller lets out a short, cynical laugh that cuts through the tension like a blade. He tells the room that Marcus wasn't working in any legitimate lab. He was breaking into a chemical storage facility on the neglected east side, the old Petrov site, a place that has been abandoned for years. Miller assumes Marcus was probably just trying to steal copper wire or something else to sell for a quick fix. At the mention of the Petrov site, Daniel's eyes sharpen with a sudden, chilling clarity that makes the nurses stop what they are doing. He knows that the Petrov site isn't just some abandoned warehouse. It's a restricted remediation zone used for the temporary storage of highly volatile industrial toxins before they are moved to permanent disposal sites. A chill that has nothing to do with the hospital's powerful air conditioning runs down his spine. The sweet smell of the organophosphates seemed to fill the room, a ghost of the Petrov site clinging to Marcus's clothes like a lethal perfume. Daniel looks closely at Marcus's fingernails and notices they are tinged with a specific, haunting shade of blue. This is cyanosis, but the presentation is fundamentally wrong for a simple lack of atmospheric oxygen. It's chemical. It's systemic. Daniel immediately turns to James and tells him to cancel the standard CT scan. He orders a toxicology screen specifically for organophosphates and demands that the hospital's full level 4 decontamination protocol be initiated at once. This means the bay is now a hot zone. Miller steps forward, his face turning from bored to angry, his hand resting instinctively on his heavy utility belt as if he's about to make an arrest. He asks if Daniel is insane, questioning why they would lock down the entire ER and cause a logistical nightmare for a petty criminal. He accuses Daniel of making a mountain out of a molehill because of his obvious debilitating exhaustion. For the first time all night, Daniel's voice drops into a low, dangerous register that silences the room. "Officer," he says, his eyes boring into Miller's, "if I'm right, this man isn't a thief. He's a victim of acute toxic exposure. And if you handled him without gloves for the last hour in that cruiser, you aren't just an officer anymore. You're a patient too. Now step back and let me do my job before we all end up in the ICU with respiratory failure." Miller is about to launch into another defensive, ego-driven tirade when the automatic doors at the ER entrance hiss open with a sudden, forceful air that draws every eye in the lobby. It's not another ambulance or a routine walk-in patient. Two men dressed in perfectly tailored charcoal suits enter. They aren't running, but they move with a terrifying, synchronized purpose that instantly commands the entire room. They don't stop at the reception desk to sign in, ask for directions, or wait for an escort. They walk straight toward the trauma bays, flashing gold credentials that stop the floor supervisor in her tracks. They aren't local police. They are federal agents from the Department of Justice. Miller's mouth hangs open, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, and the bravado he had been using to mask his impatience evaporates instantly into the sterile, ozone-scented air. The taller agent, a man named Sterling with eyes like flint, addresses the room with a voice that carries the absolute weight of federal authority. He announces that they are looking for a man named Marcus Thorne, who was picked up 20 minutes ago at the Petrov site. Miller, suddenly looking much smaller and less significant than he did moments ago, snaps to a clumsy attention. He stammers that he has the suspect right here, and that he was just finishing clearing him for booking. Sterling doesn't even bother to look at Miller. To him, the officer is a non-factor. His eyes are fixed entirely on Daniel. He sees the stains on the doctor's scrubs, the heavy, dark circles under his bloodshot eyes, and the steady, unwavering way he is currently holding a needle to draw more arterial blood. "Doctor," Sterling says, his voice sounding like cold steel hitting a marble floor, "this man is a key witness in a major federal investigation into illegal chemical dumping and corporate espionage. We need him alive, and we need him conscious. What is his current medical status?" Daniel doesn't blink. He doesn't act impressed by the gold badges, the suits, or the sudden influx of federal power. To him, these men are just more obstacles crowding his ER while a man is dying. He gives a precise clinical summary stating that the patient is in acute respiratory distress and that he suspects exposure to a stabilized nerve agent or a high-concentration pesticide. He informs the agents that he has already initiated decontamination and ordered the necessary atropine antidote. Sterling turns to his partner, Agent Vance, with a brief, approving nod. He notes that the doctor caught the exposure before they even arrived on the scene. He then finally turns his gaze toward Officer Miller, who is currently trying to disappear into the beige, peeling wallpaper of the trauma bay. Sterling asks if Miller followed the standard hazmat protocol during the arrest. When Miller stammers that he didn't think and that the guy just looked like a common burglar, Sterling simply shakes his head in visible disgust. He tells Miller that he nearly killed a primary federal witness and has likely contaminated his own patrol cruiser in the station's locker room. He orders the officer to stand in the hallway and wait for the hazmat decon team, strictly warning him not to touch a single surface or person. The power dynamic in the room has shifted with violent, jarring speed. The cop who had been mocking the sleepy doctor only minutes ago is now a major liability, a potential victim of his own negligence. The doctor he was mocking is now the only person standing between the mission's success and the patient's death. Daniel continues to work, completely unfazed by the presence of federal suits or the looming threat of chemical poisoning. He coordinates the administration of atropine and meticulously monitors Marcus's lung sounds, listening for the telltale signs of clearing. He is the anchor in a rising storm of federal agents, medical alarms, and the invisible threat of contamination. Despite having labored for over 14 hours without a break, Daniel's mind is functioning like a high-precision computer. The rhythm on the EKG monitor skipped, a jagged PVC that made James gasp. Daniel didn't move. He kept his eyes on the needle, his breathing perfectly synchronized with the drip. "Push the second dose," he commanded. The silence that followed was a physical entity, heavy and cold, until the heart finally found its steady, rhythmic cadence again. The agents let out breaths they didn't know they were holding. He catches a subtle, dangerous drop in the patient's potassium levels on the latest labs and corrects it with a potassium drip before the man's heart can slip into a fatal arrhythmia. The federal agents watch him in a respectful, heavy silence. They've seen heroes in movies and on the news, but they recognize real heroism when they see it in the flesh. It's the guy who stays perfectly calm, ignores the insults, and does his job when everyone else is losing their heads to panic or ego. Agent Vance approaches Daniel during a brief lull in the activity while they wait for the next set of vitals. He asks if he is Daniel Carter, formerly of Johns Hopkins. When Daniel nods while adjusting an IV drip, Vance smiles slightly, a rare moment of warmth in his professional facade. He tells Daniel that he has read his peer-reviewed papers on emergency toxicology and that the department was hoping the witness would end up in a hospital with someone who actually knew what they were doing. Daniel looks the agent in the eye and tells him that it isn't about luck or his resume. "It's just the protocol," he says, his voice flat. "Every patient in this ER gets the same level of care, regardless of who brings them in, why they are here, or what they are suspected of doing." Miller, standing sheepishly and alone by the door, under the watchful, judging eye of the other agent, hears this. The realization finally hits him like a physical blow to the chest. Daniel wasn't being slow, lazy, or half asleep because he was tired. He was being thorough because he respected the life in front of him, even a life that Miller had dismissed as worthless, subhuman baggage. As the sun begins to rise over the Dallas skyline, casting long shadows across the ER floor, Marcus's vitals finally begin to stabilize. The antidote is taking hold. The tremors are subsiding, and his breathing is becoming regular. The witness is going to survive, and the investigation will continue. If you believe professionalism matters under pressure, type IOU. At 6:30 in the morning, Daniel's relief finally arrives. Even though he is on the absolute verge of physical collapse, he finishes his final patient notes with the same meticulous care and attention to detail that he used during the very first hour of his shift. He doesn't skip a single detail, knowing that the federal agents will be using his notes as evidence in court. Marcus is currently being prepped for transport to a highly secure federal medical facility where he can be debriefed in safety. Before they leave, Agent Sterling stops Daniel at the nurse's station, offering a firm, respectful handshake that lingers for a second. He thanks the doctor, telling him that his clinical intuition saved more than just a single life tonight. It saved a 3-year federal investigation into a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. Daniel simply nods, his expression unreadable, and tells the agent to make sure Marcus finishes the full course of the antidote and stays on a heart monitor for at least 48 hours. As the federal team wheels the patient out, Officer Miller is still waiting by the door, his hands in his pockets. Miller watched the doctor's hands, the hands he had called sleepy. They were the most awake thing in the entire city. He saw the way the nurses looked at Daniel, not with pity for his exhaustion, but with a reverence that couldn't be bought with a uniform or a title. He has been cleared by the hazmat decon team after a thorough scrubbing, but he has been stripped of his prisoner, his pride, and his sense of superiority. He approaches Daniel as the doctor is finally grabbing his worn coat from the staff locker. Miller looks down at his boots, the arrogant, aggressive posture he had carried into the ER hours ago, completely gone, replaced by a profound sense of shame. "Hey, Doc," Miller mutters, his voice low and remarkably humble. I wanted to apologize about what I said earlier, and for being such a jerk about the paperwork and the timing. I was out of line. Daniel stops and looks at him. He doesn't look angry, triumphant, or even slightly satisfied. He just looks incredibly, profoundly tired. A man who has given everything he has to the night. He tells the officer that it's fine, that Miller was just doing his job while Daniel was doing his. But Miller shakes his head vigorously. No, he says. You were doing your job a lot better than I was doing mine. I saw a criminal who was a nuisance. You saw a human being who was a patient. I thought you were slow. I didn't realize you were just being better at the details than I was capable of being. Daniel offers a small, weary smile, one that barely reaches his eyes but conveys a sense of shared humanity. He tells Miller that in the ER, the details are the only thing that actually matters. We just follow the protocol, he says softly. It's what keeps the chaos at bay. If we stop following it, we're just people in a room watching each other die. Miller nods slowly and offers a respectful touch to the brim of his cap. He promises not to forget that lesson and tells Daniel to go get some sleep because he damn sure earned it. As Daniel walks toward the sliding glass doors of the parking lot, the nurses on the morning shift watch him go with a mix of awe and respect. The entire atmosphere in the ER has changed. There's a renewed sense of pride and professional weight in the air. They aren't just staff in a busy hospital. They are the guardians of a sacred life-saving code. Daniel climbs into his car, the bright morning sun reflecting off the Dallas glass and steel. He is exhausted, his muscles ache with every movement, and his eyes burn from the lack of sleep and the harsh hospital lights. But as he pulls out of the lot, his mind is quiet and still. He knows that tonight, the system worked exactly the way it was designed to. Not because of a badge, a gun, or a fancy suit, but because he refused to let the noise, the pressure, and the insults of the world distract him from the steady heart beating on the table. He drove home in silence, the quiet professional returning to the shadows until the next shift. If you believe respect should go both ways, type, I will live with honor. In the high-pressure, often chaotic world of the emergency room, there are truly no small decisions and no insignificant moments. Every choice made, every lab test ordered, and every minute spent quietly observing a patient is a vital thread in the complex, fragile fabric of someone's survival. We often live in a modern world that places an exaggerated, often dangerous value on the loud, the fast, and the overtly aggressive. We frequently mistake pure speed for efficiency and loud noise for genuine, earned authority. But the story of Dr. Daniel Carter serves as a powerful, enduring reminder that the most effective tool in any crisis is a disciplined, observant, and calm mind. A quiet professional is someone who doesn't feel the need to bark orders, demand respect, or perform for an audience. Their respect is earned naturally and undeniably through the precision of their actions and the unwavering integrity of their choices when no one is looking. When you are pushed to your absolute physical and mental limit, when you have been working for 14 hours straight and someone is mocking your exhaustion to your face, how do you choose to respond? Do you fight back with angry words to defend your fragile ego? Or do you lean deeper into your training, your experience, and your oath? Daniel didn't save Marcus Thorne to prove Officer Miller wrong, though he certainly did that. He didn't even do it to impress the federal agents or gain their favor. He did it because he took an oath to protect human life, regardless of the circumstances or the character of the person on the table. The code isn't about personal power, social standing, or winning an argument. It's about having the deep humility to realize that every single person, from the petty thief caught in a warehouse to the billionaire in a penthouse, deserves your absolute best, even when you are feeling at your absolute worst. It is about the realization that excellence is a habit, not an act. We tell these stories because the world is full of Daniel Carters, people who hold the line in the middle of the night, maintaining the invisible structures of our society while the rest of the world sleeps in safety. They don't ask for public recognition, they don't seek the spotlight, and they don't care for the praise of the crowd. They just follow the protocol. They just stay calm. And in doing so, they quietly change everything. The next time you see someone working diligently and quietly in the background, remember this truth. The calmest mind in the room is usually the one holding the entire world together. Be that mind. Be that professional. If you believe the quiet professionals who solve the hardest problems deserve recognition, leave a comment and subscribe to The Veteran Story. We tell the stories behind the calm minds that change everything.